everyone. Welcome
to our Weathering the Elements program here this Saturday. Luckily we have a sunny day, but as we know, Seattle is often not sunny and you need clothing to deal with that. So we're going to learn a little bit more about the history and the different technologies. There's going to be 2 presentations, so feel free to stick around after this one too. But we're going to be starting with Colin Berg to learn a little bit more about the history of Eddie Bauer. Before we begin, though, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we're on here at MOHAI on the historic and contemporary lands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, and Coast Salish people. We acknowledge the forced displacement of Native communities from this land while honoring the endurance of the Duwamish people who still live here. To this day, the Duwamish people have yet to receive federal recognition. And here at MOHAI, we encourage you to go to the Duwamish Longhouse, which is over in West Seattle, to learn more about them and both the history and present-day realities of the tribe. Understanding our past connects us to the present, and MOHAI is committed to exploring the full complexity of history. So it's my honor now to introduce our first speaker, Colin Berg, who has been the brand historian at Eddie Bauer since 2007. Prior to that, he was on the company's writing staff from 1995 to 2004. As the historian, he curates the company's archives and conducts tours. He also continues to write and serves as the brand storyteller, speaking both nationally and internationally. So we're very lucky to have you here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Apologize for the gloves. It's formal dress, so. I've brought a few samples from the archives. You're free at the end if you want to come and look at them more closely, and I'll pull up a couple of them as we go. When my wife and I first moved to Seattle a little over 30 years ago, one of the first places we visited was Pike Place Market, not surprisingly. And I recall that one of the vendors was selling screen-printed T-shirts that said, Seattle Rain Festival, January 1st and December 31st. Well, obviously, that's a little bit of an overstatement. Seattle has earned its reputation as a rainy place. We get rain about 150 days of the year, so not quite half the time, but pretty close to it. And so anybody that has lived here, and there have been people living here for millennia, has had to figure out ways to stay dry. The Salish tribes for centuries made hats and cakes and clothing out of cedar bark, not the external brittle bark, but the inner soft bark that they wove into hats. Really an ingenious form of waterproof apparel. And then more recently, they also, their knitters, were developing knitwear. Eddie used to carry the native tribal knits, both these socks like these, heavy sweaters and hats, and it was hand-carded, hand-spun wool that wasn't overly processed, so it hadn't been overwashed, and so there was still a lot of the natural lanolin in the wool, so it was essentially waterproof. Those socks were very popular with a lot of the early mountaineering expeditions that Eddie Bauer outfitted. Into the 50s and 60s, these guys were still using the Indian socks. And we have photos from one of the expeditions in the early 1950s, a famous expedition to K2 in Pakistan. And one of the climbers is in this picture actually has one of these socks with an elastic strap attached to it, and he's wearing the sock over his face, and the bottom of the sock is cut open. And it was actually what they called a rebreather. It was a tool, I guess you could say, that one of the Seattle Mountaineers, Only Diver, had developed. And the idea was that by putting this woolen sock with an open end over your nose, then obviously it would, as you exhaled, would heat the air inside the sock, and you'd be breathing in this warm air, so that when you're at high elevation and severe cold, you weren't inhaling super cold air. So it was a fairly ingenious application of a local piece of knitwear. So even more recently, after the native tribes, as the Europeans started coming into Seattle, one of the early developers of waterproof gear was C.C. Filson. Mr. Filson, of course, first was outfitting the prospectors during the Klondike Gold Rush in the late 19th century. And then after the gold rush, he started really focusing on the loggers and the local industries. And so was developing heavy-duty wax cotton, the tin cloth that they still make beautiful pieces that Filson has made for 100 years or more. They still do. And there's a piece here that it actually isn't Filson, but it's very much like it, a heavy wax cotton piece. And so those early examples of waterproof gear, from the cedar bark to the knitwear to the wax cottons, were effective in keeping dry, but were very, very heavy. And like, say with the Filson stuff, or like the Eddie Bauer wax cotton jacket, they're really built for hunting and logging and heavy-duty gear. But if you're just a resident in Seattle, you don't necessarily want to wear a 10-pound jacket walking down the street. And time out there. And so part of the challenge is not how do you make something not only waterproof but lightweight. And so that became one of the first challenges of the design technology. And so at Bauer, of course, one of the things that Eddie was most famous for was down. This is the Skyliner jacket, the first down jacket patent in the United States. Eddie came out with it in 1936. This one is from 1940. The Europe is patented. And the slide on the screen there is from the 1944 catalog for the Skyliner. And it says that this jacket, although not intended as a rain garment, will keep one dry in a day-long downpour. I suspect that that's probably Eddie being a little bit hyperbolic. Although it does also say down towards the end that the fabric has a is dry waterproof by a special process. We don't actually know what that technology was. It's not a wax cotton, although it is a cotton shell. And we know that during World War II, when he was making down-insulated flight suits for the military, one of the main criteria they gave him for that flight suit was that they wanted it to keep a flyer warm, not only warm, sitting still in minus 70-degree temperatures, but also buoyant enough that if they were shot down over water, it would keep them then floating for up to 24 hours. So in order to be buoyant for that long in the water, obviously the fabric would have to be pretty nearly waterproof. So there was some sort of technology that was able to seal the cotton, although we're not exactly sure what that was. So that was one form of creating a waterproof jacket that was certainly lighter than the cotton, wax cotton mackinaws and hunting jackets. But another aspect of it was using wool, where in Eddie's time, wool was the technical fabric of the day. Pretty much everything in the early catalogs, any woven piece was wool. And this piece here, it has an Eddie Bauer label in it, but I'm certain it probably was made for us by Filson. It's essentially their Filson cruiser shirt. And if you look at it closely afterwards, you can see that the dense weave of the wool. And change the slide on this, and you'll see the catalog. This piece was sold for several years in the 40s in the Eddie Bauer catalog. And in the highlighted text down at the bottom, it says, has the ability to shed rain all day. So again, I think that it's probably adds to, to all, it seems unlikely that you would really be able to wear it and stay completely dry. But wool is much more resistant to water absorption than, say, cotton and so forth. And so it was another means of being, at least offering water repellency, if not absolute waterproofness. But then the challenge again, looking for something that would keep you waterproof and also be lightweight. There's a whole range of activities that functionality would be desirable for. And since Eddie was an outdoor outfitter, it was hunting and fishing, primarily skiing, and any activity that was taking outdoors. And so a lot of the rainwear that was sold from the 40s into the 70s had rubber parts woven into it. So this Hodgman piece, Hodgman is an old company from Massachusetts, and Eddie carried products from all different varieties, from all different vendors and manufacturers in the early years. So this one was cotton-based neoprene, certainly waterproof, but I don't know if, for those of you that are old enough to remember rubber rain suits, they keep you dry theoretically, but they, if you wear them for any length of time, you perspire so much in them that you're soaking mud from the inside out. So, and that brings up sort of the third real critical component of waterproof fabric. It's not only does it need to be waterproof and ideally lightweight, but in some ways, even more importantly, breathable so that you can functionally wear it. Because there's not much point in staying dry from the outside in if you're soaking mud from the inside out. So these pieces would have the advantage of being able to keep you dry from the outside in. But if you wear them for any length of time, neoprene or any kind of rubber-based product is going to be a hothouse wearing them. So as you get into the 50s, again, it's still basically that kind of technology, using a lightweight, something like a nylon shell. So for example, this rainwear on the left-hand side, it starts with two layers of fabric with a layer of rubber between them. The one on the right does just the opposite, where it's a lightweight nylon with rubber coating on both sides. So they're experimenting with the waterproofness and reducing the weight significantly, but hasn't really been able to address from a technology standpoint breathability. If you get into the 60s, Eddie started importing what he said was Norway's finest sports rainwear, guaranteed completely waterproof. The seams were fully sealed and so forth. Again, very lightweight, but only marginally more breathable. They started experimenting with special coatings. This one was called Super K coating. Again, not exactly sure what it was. It was probably some sort of a polyvinyl. And then in the 70s, we were using a British manufacturer for a lot of the rainwear. And this jacket is it's actually a cycling jacket. And you see this strap that's hanging down from the hem. It's actually a strap that goes between your legs and Velcros on the front of the jacket so that when you're in the down position on drop handlebars or something, the back of the jacket doesn't ride up. Now, as a cyclist myself, I can't imagine any time in the world that I would want to have a strap between my legs while riding a bike and keep my jacket down. Nor have I ever worn a jacket that rode up so far that it would get me to do that. But it was I don't know if that was a British thing or if somebody at Eddie Bauer thought it was a good idea and they agreed to do it for us. But not only did it have that unusual design, you can see how stiff and crinkly and noisy this fabric is. Now it does have some good, like the reflective materials and stuff was kind of a cool idea. But the stiffness of the fabric was unusual. When we first got that at the archive, I thought that it was probably that something had been misused or been exposed to salt water or something like that. But then we got a second one, and it's exactly the same. So it must have been characteristic of the fabric itself and whatever it is they were coating it with. Well, I guess that's the last of the slides. So that jacket was sold in 1974. That's the 1974 catalog. And in 1976, waterproof, breathable outerwear took a quantum leap forward when Gore-Tex first came on the market. W.L. Gore had discovered the Gore-Tex in laboratories, and they've been trying to find an outdoor retailer, an outdoor manufacturer to try the fabric. And they came to Eddie Bauer, and they went to North Face, and they went to Columbia, and they couldn't find anybody who would buy into it until they went to Early Winters, which was another Seattle-based catalog company. And the marketing guy from Gore-Tex did a test for the people at Early Winters where they took a cup of hot coffee and then they put a piece of this Gore-Tex fabric over it and fastened it really tightly with a rubber band. And you could see the steam from the coffee rising up through the fabric. And then they picked up the cup and turned it upside down, and the coffee didn't leak out. So it was demonstrating really graphically the principle of waterproof and breathable. So because the pores in the fabric were small enough to prevent water droplets from passing through, but large enough so that the vapor could pass through, so that it was breathable. And so this was really a dramatic, really the quantum leap forward in waterproof apparel. Early Winters came out first with a tent, actually, made with fabric, and then with a jacket. The first time that Eddie Bauer, after seeing what was happening, they said, well, we kind of missed the boat on that one. And so it was about 3 years later that Eddie Bauer came out with their first Gore-Tex jacket. So that you're able to get a much lighter weight, softer fabric usually, and both waterproof and breathable, which so that you can actually wear it and not feel like you're in a hothouse. So today the fabric technologies are, have continued to evolve so that the designers have choices in fabrics and functionalities that could only have been dreamed of even 10 years ago, or 20, 30, 40 years ago. So, for example, I showed you that bicycling jacket with the incredibly stiff fabric. This is a waterproof, breathable, soft shell that Eddie Bauer makes now. And you can see that it's very, very pliable and soft and fully waterproof. And if you come up here and feel it, you feel it's extraordinarily soft fabric. In comparison to the heaviness of say, a wax cotton, which admittedly is not really, it's made for really heavy-duty performance. This is a waterproof jacket that weighs less than 7 ounces. The women's version of it weighs about 5 ounces, so it's super lightweight, and yet, again, fully waterproof and breathable. It's interesting with waterproof and breathable fabrics, there are different there are laboratory tests that test both the waterproofness and the breathability in different scales. So this BC uplift has a 20,000, 20K, 20K breathability. So it's, it's the high end of waterproofness and of breathability. And then this piece here is a waterproof down jacket. Now you notice that there isn't any quilting in this jacket, which typically in traditional down jackets, like this guy right here, in order for the down to stay in place, there's either quilting or baffling so that it doesn't all end up down in the hem, and so your thighs are really warm and the rest of you is freezing. Well, this jacket, the BC Evertherm, uses a new down technology called thin down from Italy, where the down is actually bonded between two thin sheets of fabric. So it's a continuous sheet of insulation. So there is no quilting in it. It's more like, it looks more like Primaloft, if those of you have ever seen synthetic insulations where it's a continuous sheet of insulation. And so it doesn't require that baffling, and yet it maintains all the thermal efficiency. So the unhooded version of the jacket, this one does have a hood, the unhooded jacket weighs about 11 ounces and is rated to -15. The hooded jacket weighs maybe 3 or 4 ounces more than that and is rated to -20. So it's, and then waterproof as well. So the climate and culture of Seattle has always inspired the ingenuity of people figuring out how to stay dry, how to do it in a way that you don't have to. People don't like to use umbrellas in Seattle. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but there's some urban legends that there are more sunglasses per capita in Seattle than any major city in the United States. And it's not really something that can be quantified. You'd think it would be more umbrellas per capita, but they say that there are more sunglasses than umbrellas in Seattle. And so we rely on things like waterproof jackets, Gore-Tex and so forth. And so now there are, Gore-Tex remains sort of the significant branded version of it, but there are all sorts of manufacturers that make either laminates or coatings that are highly breathable and waterproof as well. Event, in fact, I think it's the BC Evertherm uses Event technology, which is like Gore-Tex. So that's just a really small sampling of the kinds of things that Bauer has done. The thing with Eddie was that as an outdoor outfitter, he was always looking to enhance whatever working tools that he needed. As an outdoorsman himself, a hunter and fishing, he spent 3 to 5 months a year out in the woods. He was continually product testing, whether or not he was formally product testing or just out hunting and fishing. And so it was his experiences out in the woods that were the driving forces of his coming up with the early ideas that he had, and that continually looking for new designs, new fabrics, new technology to enhance the experience, to enhance the performance of his products. And that has continued to be the focus at Bauer, and really at all the companies that do technical outerwear. And Filson continues to make these amazing box cottons and so forth. They do a real traditional approach to things, but they do it in a way that is really nonpareil. And you know, one of the other companies that's out doing sounds that the Abling company has a really interesting fabric technology where they are using this fillium woven into with the cotton so that it repels moisture and stains and stuff. And you've probably seen the demonstrations. If you haven't, you should go see them where they'll pour, you know, vividly colored liquid over this fabric and it just rolls off and stuff, which is, for those of us that are a little on the sloppier side of the table, it's a great thing in addition to if you're actually trying just to protect yourself from the elements in the environment. So at this point, if you have any questions, happy to answer them, or if you want to come up and look at it, and you don't have to wear gloves to handle the stuff. You can feel the fabrics, and just get a sense of how they've changed over time.
We're going to ask if you have questions to speak into the microphone because we're recording today, and that way anybody who listens later can hear your brilliant questions.
Hi. Well, you mentioned there was a 20K spec on waterproofing. Can you explain what that references?
Yeah, there are three primary levels: 5K, 5K, 10K, 10K, 20K, 20K. It has to do with the first number, like say the first 20,000 has to do with the waterproofness. It's how much, I can remember exactly, it's a laboratory test. It's like the amount of water, or the water amount of water pressure it will withstand before it starts leaking water through the fabric. The breathability, the second 20K, 20K, has to do with the amount of air pressure required before it's, that it will, it measures the breathability. I'm not remembering exactly the scientific language of what it is, but it's in these laboratory tests that they put in some sort of control where they put a volume of water against the fabric to see how long it will withstand before it seeps in. And they do a similar thing with the air pressure to see how much air permeability it has, so how well it breathes. So that some fabrics, they might, it might be 20K, 10K, or 2015 or something like that, or 1525 or something like that. It varies depending on if it's more waterproof or non-waterproof. What you're looking for is a good combination of both. Yeah.
Oh. Sorry, just a moment.
I'm just curious, did the early technologies like vortex and others develop here because of the outdoor culture, or were they brought here because of it and manufactured here? Or
Well, vortex specifically, W.L. Gore is from the East Coast. I mean, actually, I think the corporate offices are in Texas now, but originally they were in Maryland, I believe. And they were looking for retailers who would buy into the concept. And they came out, they came to Bauer, they came to North Face, they came to Columbia, some of the prominent outdoor manufacturers at the time. And a lot of them were on the West Coast or in the Pacific Northwest. And the first one they sold the idea to was, as I said, was Early Winters, who happened to be in Seattle. So that it wasn't made here. But it was, this is a perfect laboratory for marketing and so forth because of mine. Yeah.
I would love to hear more about the process of finding the new, hair that's new down that's bonded from Italy. How do you find it, and how does it work its way through into becoming a finished product?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure if I can answer it in detail. I know that at Bauer, the sourcing team works really closely in collaboration with the technical designers and so forth to find, and like the thin down, the Evertherm jacket that we have is part of our First Ascent line of mountaineering and ski gear technical outerwear. And those products are developed in collaboration with professional guides, mountain and ski guides and so forth. And so the guides have really specific perspectives on what they need as guides and what their clients need in these extreme environments and so forth. And so it starts in some ways with the guide saying, this is what we need, this is what we want, these are the parameters, the functional parameters we want. And then the technical designers and the sourcing team will say, okay, let's go find the product, let's go find the fabrics, the insulation materials, and so forth. We'll do that. And so the sourcing team, it's basically a global marketplace for pretty much everybody that does this kind of stuff, North Face, Patagonia, Marmot, anybody. The mills are all over the world, and so as they follow the hints of when these things are being developed and so forth, and they have, they establish relationships with mills and manufacturers, factories all over the world, and so that they know, so that those mills and those factories that are working, developing technical fabrics, they know the companies that make the technical products, and so when they have this new idea, it's going back and forth because it's in everybody's best interest to keep each other apprised of what they're either working on or what they're aiming towards. As far as the thin down technology, I'm not exactly sure how long the company in Italy how long it's been available there. I know that when it first came to Bauer in 2017, we had an exclusive right to it in the United States for 2 years, from 2017 to 2018. Now it's, as far as I know, it's available for other U.S. manufacturers as well.
When did the industry go from being primarily aimed towards mountaineers, fishermen, that kind of thing, to everyday wear? And is that something that's really specific to the Pacific Northwest?
Well, I can speak to that in terms of Eddie Bauer. Eddie, was a hunter and fisherman. In the 20s, when he started, sporting goods stores in Seattle were hunting and fishing stores primarily. I mean, they sold tennis rackets and badminton and golf equipment and so forth, but they were primarily hunting and fishing stores. And that was Eddie's passion. And so in the early years, when he developed the down jackets and so forth, that was a natural progression into expedition outfitting, mountaineering, and skiing, and that kind of thing. So for the first 50, 60 years of the company, that was really the main focus. And then as you get into the early 1980s, what had been this originally a family-owned company, and then when Eddie and his son sold to their two partners, another man and son, in 1968, then the Nemais that they sold to General Mills in 1971. And interestingly enough, when General Mills bought Eddie Bauer in 1971, they did so because a lot of the executive leadership at General Mills were Eddie Bauer customers, were hunters and fishermen, and so they loved the company and wanted to keep it going. But they also, at the same time, or about the same time, they bought Talbot's, the women's wear catalog from Boston. And so they suddenly had these two sibling companies from opposite sides of the country in completely different cultures. A Pacific Northwest male-dominated outdoor company, and an Eastern Seaboard women's fashion catalog. And so they had each other's mailing lists, but to what avail? And so Eddie Bauer started in the early 70s with Talbot's catalog, started emphasizing more women's wear. And then gradually, as you get into the 80s, the early 80s, more and more of the outdoorsmen and leaders of the Bauer company had moved on to other things. And so the General Mills, as they were replacing them, they were replacing them with people with MBAs, and who were merchants and marketers, but weren't necessarily outdoors people, and they weren't necessarily from the Northwest. And so their interest became increasingly to broaden the customer base. So it seemed like, obviously you want to keep growing, and so you're looking to broaden the customer base and moving from strictly an outdoor outfitting company into a sort of casual sportswear lifestyle brand. For example, in 1984, Eddie Bauer entered a long-term relationship with the Ford Motor Company. Eddie Bauer Explorers and Expeditions and all those things. As part of that interest in expanding the base of the brand. Also started going into dress casual wear and Eddie Bauer home, with quilts and bedding and that sort of stuff. And so it was this intentional shift to broaden the base. At the same time, the retail shopping experience was dramatically changing, migrating from the idiosyncratic downtown shopping districts that had large stores with big footprints, and the Eddie Bauer store at 3rd and Virginia, for example, in Seattle, had full mount lions and rhinoceros. I mean, it was like a diorama while you're shopping for down jackets and stuff like that. Well, in the 70s and the early 80s, as the Northgate Mall and the other malls started reopening, retailing started migrating into the suburbs, into the malls, and the store footprints were much smaller and much more homogeneous. So full mount tigers and lions looked a little odd at Northgate Mall. And so the tents and sleeping bags that took up a lot of space in the store became not a viable choice. You had to be looking at how much you were earning per square foot and stuff. And so all those things were playing together, so that at Bauer it became this increasingly moving farther and farther away from the original roots and focus of the brand. And it wasn't until 2007 when the new CEO came, who felt that in order to revitalize the brand, it needed to go back more to its roots, to integrate the outdoor outfitting and expedition outfitting with some of the modern stuff as well. And so there was an integration of the past, present, and future all at the same time. So that's sort of what Eddie Bauer as a brand is about.
Any other question? Sounds like people can take a look at the
Sure.
garments.
Feel free to come and look at the products if you like.
Thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you.
Do you know some of these stuff?
Off the top of my head, I want to say something
Very cool. You feel like it would be what?
Yeah, no, it's surprising. Yeah.
I figure it's for climbers, so. Pretty big.
I wonder if it's packable. I wonder if you can, because some of those down coats, they pack pretty small.
I was looking at this, I had a jacket a few years ago, and it was rainproof outer coating and down sill, and I could wear it, like a laundry night or something. But I didn't know, and they don't make them like that anymore. This is the only one that had a white one, waterproof. I think because of the coating.
Because it's bonded.
You got it. Hey.
Yeah, I know that's how our architect too, where, if Clara
Yeah, I was
or
looking at one of these, but oh my God,
Constance
they're expensive.
This is
probably
well, they have these rubber zippers you can buy.
part of the function.
It's fabric. You could buy
It by the yard, and then you just use what you want. Yeah.
but it's kind of crazy because it's an accent.
On a jacket, you know, I hadn't thought
Doesn't even
about
have
doing a contrasting color like that. Yeah.
Take care of them.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. And then this is,
One of the ads had like
we're looking.
noiseless to the touch in it, and I was like, you don't have to say that now with modern materials. Well, we did this with welding last. I have a bunch of jacket zippers like this.
Yeah.
I would say